Koliko god bila stara i dobro poznata, hipnoza je ipak fascinantan fenomen. Ona pokazuje koliko slojeva imaju naša svijest i naša sjećanja. Pokazuje i to koliko je zapravo lako programirati ili preprogramirati ljudski um. Hipnozu se danas koristi uglavnom u terapeutske svrhe, ali sve njezine temeljne metode prisutne su i izvan ordinacije u kojima se to zbiva, u ovom svijetu oko nas, u kojem živimo. Steven Russell Poplin, hipnoterapeut je i autor knjige Dim i zrcala, u kojoj je pokazao kako nas društvo sve temeljito hipnotizira, a da toga kao svaki hipnotizirani nismo niti svjesni. Sve poznate hipnotizerske tehnike prisutne su oko nas, a i mi sami ih koristimo u svakodnevnom životu, prema drugim ljudima i svoj djeci i tome slično. No, Steven Russell Poplin bio je i dugogodišnji međunarodni direktor instituta Michaela Newtona, psihijatra koji je pomoću regresija prvi put iznenađeno zavirio u tajanstveno razdoblje između života. Dovoljno razloga da sastanak dogovorimo ovdje, na Rubu Znanosti. Dobro večer. Steven Russell Poplin je transpersonalni hipnoterapeut koji se specijalizirao za područja regresija protekle živote, također i autor knjige Dim i ogledala koja se bavi masovnom hipnozom u politici SAD-a, a nekoliko godina bio je međunarodni direktor instituta Michael Newton za istraživanje života između života. Dobro večer.
Dobar večer.
Vi ste prvi hipnoterapeut kojeg imamo u studiju, pa je to možda i dobra prilika da nam kažete što je to zapravo hipnoza.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thanks for inviting me, Krishmir. Hypnosis has been around for thousands of years, and many different cultures used altered states or getting people into a trance state so that they could usually aid people for healing purposes. But also in theater, in ancient Greece, as well as in ancient Egypt, they had used theater to put a person into an emotional state or into a different consciousness, and then in that way they could pull them into either a more positive area, but for instance the Greek word catharsis, representing to get rid of or to get out of you, they used tragedies in their theater because they felt that when the audience watching a particular show, they would cry, they would feel the pain, then they would get rid of course, the negative energy, the negative tears or the pain that was in them, and that was a form of healing. So it's been known for a long time, and even a lot of shamans in many different cultures, whether that be in Siberia, the Amazon, Native American shamans, they too would use different types of tools like rattles and drums, and again, with the rhythm, with the visuals, sometimes they would use masks to sometimes scare people or to bring forth different feelings, then those people too would go into kind of a trance sort of state or an altered state, and then either they would plant a suggestion, move them in a slightly different direction, help them to improve with some particular issue, or to alleviate some sort of anxiety or fear. Many different ways throughout many, many centuries, people have used this, usually in kind of an unconscious way, to help people, again, to get out of the everyday normal awareness and into something that they knew was a bit different but could bring out kinds of extraordinary powers, awarenesses, insights, and so forth. You may know about Thomas Edison, the great inventor. He recognized that in his regular scientific awareness, he could come up with a lot of useful, resourceful types of approaches towards his experiments. But he also knew that if he was in an altered state, he could come up with something outside of his normal awareness. And so he would sleep very little in his laboratory. Sometimes he would spend days and days and weeks in his laboratory. And he would put a book underneath his elbow, and he'd get really tired, and he'd be working on his program, and then he would get sleepy, his arm would relax, the book would fall on the floor, and he'd wake up, but then he wanted that little piece of time in which, maybe a new idea would come to him. And so again, it's a different area. It's sometimes called the subconscious, and it has been said that a very good metaphor for the consciousness in general is the iceberg, which is about 10% of the iceberg over the surface of the air, and then under the water is about 90%. And this subconscious, all of our automatic responses and the things from our past and our emotions and our instincts are found, or let's say stored in the subconscious. And when someone goes into a hypnotic state, and hypnosis comes from the word sleep, the Greek word for sleep, but it wasn't really coined or came into being until about 1850, when Dr. Braid, who was a Scottish surgeon, coined that term. Even after a few years after he coined it, however, he decided that it really wasn't sleep, but it was kind of a trance or a sleepy type of state. But someone would go into the subconscious with that metaphor again of the iceberg. And from there, all of our instincts and emotions and memories that we don't consciously remember would still be stored there some way. And even in detective work, law enforcement, special investigations, certain types of interviews, the hypnotist would put the subject into this trance state or into a hypnotic state and be able to find out details that you normally wouldn't remember, very fine details.
Za mene osobno je hipnoza bila dosta poučna stvar po pitanju toga koliko je naša svijest, sjećanje zapravo nepouzdano. Gledao sam televizijske emisije u kojima su hipnotizeri na pozornici s lakoćom zapravo hipnotizirali ljude da jedu zamišljene jabuke i da osjećaju okus, da voze autiće kojih u stvari nije bilo, da sjede u dječji autić misleći da je to njihov Porsche. Tog je bilo dosta po televizijama u zadnjih 30-40 godina i doista je pomalo zabrinjavajuće koliko je lako čovjeku preprogramirati da vidi nešto što ne postoji. Skoro da se čovjek zapita da možda i ovaj program koji imamo nije baš tako pouzdan kao što se čini.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. I'm really fascinated with that whole subject of, what can be programmed, and what you've just mentioned are called the positive and negative input. And on a positive, you have them believe something that's really not there. Negative, have them disappear something that really is there. Okay, and besides doing the apples and the little cars that are Porsches, one can give a hypnotized person an onion and say, "Oh, this is the sweetest apple you've ever had."
Ali on mu u stvari daje cijelu novu stvarnost koja za ostale ne postoji.
That's true. Yeah. And during that period of time, usually up on a stage or for an experiment or something, the person can really truly believe that.
Na koje načine koriste hipnozu za pomaganje ljudima, znači za poboljšavanje zdravlja, problema, rješavanje fobija, s obzirom da je to jedna od tih pozitivnih učinaka i metoda korištenja hipnoze?
That's true, yeah. It's something one has to really be careful about because, yes, you can implant some negative ideas or ideas that are not true. And so the, let's say, interviewing hypnotist or the ethical hypnotist has to be very careful about choosing just the right words that will not influence a person, but really to lead them towards some sort of truth, or usually some towards alleviation of pain. For instance, when someone has some sort of pain and the medical personnel, doctors, have already investigated, and they found that really there's no particular reason for it, or we can't really find some sort of physical reason for it. So it may be a psychosomatic problem. And then a particular pain could be coming from something that happened in your youth, 5 years old, 10 years old, and something really grabbed a hold of you. And then there is this thing called a trigger or a cue that later on, whether it be a smell, a sight, something triggers the person, and then they will have that old 5-year-old pain again, and they don't know exactly why. So to go back, again, we can't remember, it's back to the subconscious. When did this first begin? When did a pattern or a pain or the symptoms begin? And then you go back in time and find out what was the trigger, what happened. And whether that be a medical hypnotist or a healing type of hypnotist would then help the person to go back and say, how can we change that? How can we make it less of an issue? How can we either make it go away or become something kind of in the background, and then it's not really hurting you anymore? And that's just, let's say, one way of doing it. I can also mention something else that is quite often used in dentistry and also in surgery for pain management. And this was actually one of the first things that I actually saw when I worked in the operating room in a hospital. A doctor was using hypnosis as anesthesia. And there was this patient on the operating room table, and he had his scalpel, and he cut into her, and she was over here just talking to the anesthetist over on the side, just chatting, da-da-da. And he was cutting her and opening her up. She didn't feel anything, didn't react to anything. And then the hypnotist said, "Stop the bleeding." And I was watching, and it stopped.
To je u stvari samo inducirani placebo na neki način.
One can say that that's a placebo, but typically a placebo is kind of an indirect type of suggestion where I will say, like there's a magic ingredient inside of this. Of course, it's only lemon water, right? Magic ingredient, or even on a stage hypnosis show, this is vodka, and the person will drink it and they will get drunk.
Dosta jeftin način za opijanje.
That's right. You can save some money.
Također se hipnozom mnoge fobije rješavaju, pretpostavljam. Neki ljudi se boje ispita na fakultetu, drugi pak imaju ovisnosti, ne mogu prestati pušiti i slično.
That's true, yeah. Phobias, fears, anxieties, and especially when it comes to study, tests, pressures, and things like that, you, again, go back to the origin. That might have been like a parent who really had a lot of pressure on the son or the daughter, or oftentimes, especially with public speaking, especially with fear of being ridiculed or having the pressure of a particular exam, especially an oral exam, you can probably go to the early school years when the child was in the middle and then all of the classmates made fun of that person, or worse yet, the teacher made fun or humiliated the young student, and of course that really stays with the person, and then years later it's still going to be there when something similar comes up. It's kind of, again, like a trigger.
To je jedna od negativnih strana hipnoze, da te može vratiti natrag u školu koju si jedva završio i slično. Čini mi se da je hipnoza dosta dobar alat za istraživanje nečeg što čak danas nema niti definiciju, a to je svijest. Niko zapravo ne zna otkud ona potiče, s čime ima veze, pretpostavlja se da ima više veze s glavom nego s nogom ili slično, ali ni to baš nije sigurno. Pa onda imamo ta neobične fenomene izvan osjetilne percepcije, pa predosjećaje iz budućnosti, pa remote viewing i gledanja na daljinu gdje se zapravo svijest prostire na neki način izvan tijela našeg i slično. U kojoj mjeri hipnoza može nama omogućiti da naučimo nešto o svijesti? Ili je to nalik čovjeku koji ne zna kako auto radi, ali ipak ga zna voziti?
already described the conscious mind, small percent of that we're kind of using all the time, very critical, analytical, good for memorizing your telephone numbers and things like that, knowing how to drive cars. And then the subconscious, but then on top of that, over that is the superconscious. This is sometimes seen a bit like, it's more elegant to think of it as a wine glass, you know, a nice shape up there, and the water or the liquid in the glass would be the subconscious, and the conscious part is this section right here, a little bit below, a little bit above, and maybe to the top. And that's the part that we're usually aware of. That's how we're talking right now. And then above that, expanding with this from my glass over to your glass and to all glasses would be the superconscious. This is how prophecies are made, or the consciousness jumping from one to another, that, again, in an emergency situation, in an emotional situation, when, let's say, a child hundreds of kilometers away from the mother is in trouble, having some sort of pain, worry, a cry for help or something, the intuition, usually called the mother's intuition or the female intuition, hears that, feels that, and then there is like an instant rapport. When we think about consciousness and the limits of consciousness, oftentimes academicians, medical personnel and so forth, they just confine that within our skin, inside of the brain itself. But consciousness can also be throughout the whole organ of the body. And then where can you find it? Is it in some subsection of the brain, the left brain, right brain, or could it be like somewhere even outside of our physical body? Consciousness may fluctuate kind of amorphously, and like I have here with this metaphor, we go deep within the emotions, going back into the past, and that's also consciousness, subconsciousness. But when it goes into the super normal abilities like telepathy, ESP, extrasensory perception, being able to sense or emotionally understand what's going on with other people, even the things connected with being able to understand or sense what animals are feeling and so forth. That goes into a whole other area of consciousness. And using hypnosis, I like to think of a good hypnotist being able to focus the inner consciousness or to direct the attention away from the everyday sorts of perspective, so that kind of all of the outside noise gets really quiet. And then when it's directed, you could imagine that each of us have kind of an antenna inside. And if you just get the right channel, just the right frequency, then you can be, let's say, mathematically attuned, or you can be musically aligned, or you can start pointing towards the extrasensory perceptions that the hypnotist can say, okay, drop out all of these other sorts of senses and get really focused on let's say, ESP. And we can have an experiment, go into a trance state, and then start reading what's inside this closed box or this package way over there. And many psychic development classes do such thing. But if they could add it to a hypnotic trance and really going into a deep altered state, and then do your psychic development class, I imagine it would probably improve quite quickly.
Spominjali ste da hipnotizer usađuje sugestiju u čovjeka, neko uvjerenje. Iz te perspektive može se reći da je društvo u kojem živimo jedan od najvećih hipnotizera, jer svi smo mi prepuni sugestija, uvjerenja, navika, tuđih misli i svega, što nas zapravo oblikuje našu kulturu, svjetonazor i slično. U tom smislu ste napisali knjigu Dim i ogledala koja se bavi masovnom hipnozom u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama, ali prije nego što kažemo nešto više o toj hipnozi, možda je bilo dobro raščistiti kojih je to 9 vrata, 9 načina, 9 puteva kojima se čovjeka hipnotizira. Uvjeren sam da ćemo se mnogi od njih pronaći dakle, stvari iz svog života i svoje prošlosti u tih 9 vrata, kako ste ih nazvali?
Obviously, it's something I've thought about a lot and wrote a book about it, and recognized that, yes, we're constantly being influenced, whether we take a look at our education, we look at our religion, and through the eyes of a hypnotist, I can see when you go into an emotional state or you go into a really focused state. Just as some examples, and I mention 9 specific examples in my book, then here one can, yes, be influenced and have certain things imprinted into your conscious mind, going into the subconscious, and then later on, whether that be triggered or whether you come across it in a particular situation, or when they start bringing up a flag, or patriotism, or a symbol like the cross, or the 6-pointed star of Judaism, or whatever it happens to be. Yes, there's many different ways throughout childhood, education, religion, your teachers, and so forth, in which people can be influenced. And then we grow up, and one can say that the majority of people are hypnotized the majority of the time. That's my basic hypothesis.
Možete li nabrojati tih 9 načina, odnosno tih 9 modela? Neke od njih se i sjećam, kao recimo autoritarne figure, osjećaj, pa nekakve povezivanja, linking i slično. Koji su ti koraci, tih 9 načina kako, se svi nekako nađemo hipnotizirani prije ili kasnije?
We can play with that, Krishimir, and you can tell me here on the list, like you mentioned, for instance, the authoritarian one, and I'll tell you about that, and then you can mention the next one, and I'll tell you about that one, and kind of like work with that. Is that okay?
U redu, bojim se da se ne mogu svih sjetiti. Zapamtio sam samo nekakve ovako najosnovnije koji su mi se činili da sam ih najviše puta vidio. Recimo povezivanje, linking je jedan od dosta efikasnih načina.
Okay. Well, I hope I'll remember the 9 too. But so authoritarian, or the authority level, is usually one of the first ones, and typically it starts off in childhood, and then you just obey your elders, mother, father, the babysitter, the nanny. And you start off, of course, really young, looking up, and here they are, bigger, stronger, they drive cars, they do amazing things. And so you give over your authority to them and just say, yes, sir, okay, will do, okay? And it could be to please them, it could be for, other reasons. But when it's an authority figure from a very young age, that's imprinted on you so that later on, as an adult, there are other authority figures who take the place of your parents. And they could be policemen, politicians, soldiers, all types of people who then you don't really go into the decision-making process. And this is the main point. When you're in a hypnotic state, when you're in an altered state, you oftentimes bypass the critical faculties to say, okay, here is an option placed before me to make a choice. In an altered state, in a hypnotic state, in a triggered, quick state, you don't even think about it, you just do it. You say, okay. And oftentimes it happens with authorities.
Jedan od važnih načina hipnotiziranja je naravno i ponavljanje. To već znamo, a u društvu isto ima nešto ponavljanja.
That's right. Repeating, repetition, hearing things many, many times. They even say in a lot of education, learn by rote is an English phrase in which you just memorize it. Okay? And so again and again and again. And then afterwards, you don't have to think about it because it's already there. It's just second nature. And also commercials and media use that a lot too, so that even when they come up with an interesting, catchy type of phrase in a commercial or a little jingle, a bit of musical thing, they start it, and then usually the person can finish it. And it's like, oh, I know this because I heard it 1,000 times.
Često puta je slabo prepoznajemo jedan od najjačih hipnotičkih alata društva, to je tradicija.
Yes. A tradition handed down from generation to generation. And so you don't think about it because, well, that's how it's just done. Because my grandparents did it, we all do it, of course you will do it too. And so that is the tradition that many people can be proud about. And many times there is an unspoken level that, of course, you do not disobey the traditions because that would be either impolite or be dishonoring other authority figures or the things that are special to us, to our people, to our religion, to us. And so you don't even want to try to criticize it because it's almost yelling or being negative towards your nice old grandmother.
Jedan od najzanimljivijih načina društvene hipnoze jeste preuzimanje različitih uloga. Pa čovjek više nije osoba, nego je neko zanimanje, profesija, status.
Yes. The role is an indirect way, a little bit different than the authority figure because someone can then have their own ideas about something, their own, let's say, individuality or even their good intentions, and then they take on the role of, let's say, a judge or a policeman or a high-level executive, and then there are some things connected to the position that one kind of takes on without really thinking about it. Even sometimes like the role of husband and wife. And that has also their own roles, connected to sometimes to tradition. And before you know it, you might be acting just like your father, and your wife is acting just like her mother, and they have taken on the roles. And all of this, again, is without thinking. It happens automatically, and it comes from usually the past.
Što se dogodilo sa mojim programom Dečko 2.0? Jednostavno se pretvorio u muža 2.0 i slično. Jedan od načina kojima, recimo, se ljude u društvu hipnotizira jest i ono što ste nazvali povezivanjem, linkingom i slično. Na koji način to funkcionira?
Linking is one of the very clever and, again, indirect ways in which people can follow a particular pattern. And usually it's not meant in this direct way, you know, like follow the tradition, do what you're told, this is how it is. It's more like, little Marco, you are just like your uncle, okay? And maybe it was meant your uncle is very good with his hands. He knows how to make things. And I have seen that with you. So sometimes it's also like a compliment. But the link part, it happens like this. It's linked like a chain, like a hook. And then little Marco knows that this uncle is very aggressive and he likes to hit sometimes. And so then, without thinking, there's this link says, no, I meant that you're good with your hands. No, this uncle likes to hit. So maybe I, says little Marco, maybe I am an aggressive person. Okay? And again, unconsciously, subconsciously, there is an association. One of the big things connected with that is found in religion. When they say, oh, you're a Jew, you're a Muslim, and that might mean to some people, oh, your faith, your tradition, your prayers, and so forth. But to some little child, to some other people, they say, I watch the news, I see what's happening over in the school. Here's the link with me and my religion.
U knjizi ste napisali vaše mišljenje da je većina ljudi na svijetu većinu vremena hipnotizirana. Pretpostavljam da ga niste promijenili.
No, I've seen it many times.
Kad ste prije pričali o ulozi, o primanju uloga, nekako se dosta jasno ukazuje slika da je, mogli bismo reći, čak i temelj svih mogućih represija u društvu upravo uzimanje uloga. Čovjek odjednom na sebe uvlači uniformu policajca ili birokrata ili bilo čega, on odjednom igra ulogu koju mu je društvo namijenilo, a on jednostavno prihvaća jer zapravo nije ni svjestan da ju prihvatio. Je li moguće to nekako odhipnotizirati ili odlogirati?
One of the great things that a conscious hypnotist can do and should do is to try and get people to wake up to what they are doing, if they're thinking things through, whether that be in a marital situation with couples counseling, and to get people to recognize that, no, you're acting like your tradition, you're acting like your grandfather, this is something that you were told, repeatedly told, and it's not really working.
Da, ali probajte reći policajcu, ponašaš se kao policajac.
That's right. You know, there's always these different strategies that one can work with, whether that be with a policeman or some authority figure. But I will say this, when this person is also in kind of an altered state, whether that they be intoxicated with this lemon juice, or they be very emotional about something, or they too, because I didn't mention yet that another one of the 9 ways is if when you're in an emotional state, you can be also in an altered state. And then some suggestions can really hook in when you're very emotional and not thinking about that. And then also in many, let's say, mob situations when there's a whole group of people and they're very anxious or angry or all kinds of emotions, then there's no talking to them, you know, and let's say the rational approach, the strategy approach towards trying to get someone who is either intoxicated, drunk, out of their mind, very emotional, there's very little that you can do. But normally, more of a conscious person recognizing all these different ways can start to use these different ways to pull a person or to encourage a person to basically wake up.
Ostavimo na trenutak ovaj svijet po strani. Bili ste međunarodni direktor instituta Michaela Newtona za istraživanje života između života. Michael Newton nije nepoznat hrvatskoj publici. Njegove knjige su objavljene kod nas. Međutim, materijom kojom se on bavio ste se bavili vi još i prije, pa ste se eto negdje sreli po putu. Objasnite nam što je to hipnotička regresija koja vodi čovjeka u prošle živote ili kako je došlo do toga da odjednom ljudi dolaze sa svojim iskustvima između onog što zovemo život ili životi.
We can make an interesting connection from the last topic into this new topic because in certain societies and cultures, the cultural hypnosis is that there is no such thing as reincarnation, you know, and then people stop to even look at that, or they just know that this is not true, and so, you know, don't confuse yourself, don't imagine, you know, get over it. But in some other traditions, Buddhist, Hindu, and some other subcultures, they automatically believe in reincarnation, and of course then they would encourage that.
Kakva su vaše iskustva?
My own personal experience?
Iskustva sa vašim pacijentima, ljudima koji su imali kroz hipnozu nekakvo osjećanje na prošli život ili na razdoblje između života.
Well, I've been doing past life regressions for more than 30 years now and have had thousands of clients, very interesting stories. But again, it first starts with this idea, is there reincarnation? Do we live just one time or do we live many different times? And one can play with that, start that as a theory. Is it true? Is it not? You can read books about it, take a look at different ancient scriptures about it, and then I think a best way to really look at it is to experience it yourself. And so that's what I first did when I started my own search, and I went and met a hypnotist and had my own past life regression and found myself going into an Irish life 400 years ago when I was fighting the British And there were great struggles and anger and sorrows and some drama connected with that. And then I had an arrow go right here into my chest, and that's how I died 400 years ago. And I have a what's called a birthmark right in this very exact place. I never thought about it.
Jedan drugi psihijatar, Jan Stevenson, je istraživao madeže kao ostatke nekih rana iz prethodnih života, pa to bi mogao biti jedan od primjera.
It would be my own personal example, but yes, I've to me at the time, it was brand new. I didn't really know too much about it, and I go, oh, how interesting that is. What a coincidence that it happens to be right here. But yeah, Ian Stevenson and many others since then, they said, okay, where do these different marks on people's bodies come from?
Zapravo su psihijatri na neki način, mnogi od njih se dotakli kroz hipnotičke regresije, odjednom na svoje iznenađenje su ustanovili da se ljudi prisjećaju prošlog života, koje se ponekad moglo i potvrditi nekakvim drugačijim dokazima. Ali da vidimo što se to zbiva sa ljudima između života. Dakle, kada zbrojite vaša iskustva, kako biste nam mogli predočiti ta zbivanja koja su do vas došle, do vaših pacijenata kroz hipnotičke regresije. Priču znamo do onog trenutka dok se uđe u tunel svjetlosti i dalje ne znamo.
Yeah, very interesting, Krešimir. It's a whole fascinating topic, and I'm glad that I read Michael Newton's books and met him and worked with him and worked with the Institute, because a lot of the work, yes, goes into, or let's say starts with past life regression, and Michael Newton would say that the door to get into the life between life is after the death in a past life. You leave the body, go into the light, go into the spirit, and from there, even theoretically, if you have an openness to reincarnation, you also can immediately say, so where does the soul go when it's not right here in the body? It must go someplace, huh? And goes it into other dimensions, or does it float around? Does it just kind of hang out and wait until its next, taxi back to the earth? But through Michael Newton's work and through others, there is this journey of the soul in which we connect with other soul group members, other friends and comrades in our spiritual journeys, and then we go to these places of education, experience, going over what happened in a past life, what did we learn, what will we do different, did we gather some karma, both positive or negative karma that we have to kind of work through, and then having higher level souls, guides, spirit guides, and communicating, having conversations, guidance sessions with them, as well as with our soul group, and then we all get together and say, okay, here are different lessons we need to deal with, some karma that we have from a past life, something that I wish to experience. Maybe someone here is too aggressive, maybe specifically too aggressive to females in a past life. Well, maybe you should be a female in this life, okay? Switch things around. And then as kind of a group, then you reincarnate together in a new place, maybe a interesting country like Croatia, or a big, large, powerful country like the United States, for different reasons, the things that you're going to pick up in those different cultures.
Spomenuli ste grupe duša. Koliko obično ima duša u jednoj grupi i jesu li one cijelo vrijeme povezane? Što zapravo njih povezuje i čini grupom?
It's kind of interesting when you start off like with children souls being born, and then they kind of go to kindergarten, and then they go into the first groups there, and probably through a sense of affinity, interest, natural things that they are inclined to be interested in, because some people are naturally more, let's say, scientific, some people are more musical, some people like humor, and so forth. And then you're kind of, you find your group that way. And then it forms, and then over a period of time, then there's more connections, more story with all of them, and it gets tighter and closer. And then after many thousands of years, probably, you could have maybe a group from 4, 5 to 30 different soul members in your group.
Oni su zapravo stalno s nama. Oni se mijenjaju uloge tijekom tih raznih života. Prijatelji, braća, sestre, majke, slično.
Yeah, they're constantly changing roles, and that makes it quite interesting probably for the souls, but sometimes here on the earth we could be a bit confused, where sometimes you can see that the little boy in the family is telling the parents what to do, or the parents seem to be a bit childlike, and then so who's really the parent here? And then you go and regress them into a past life and say, well, guess what? The boy was the father.
Kako duše biraju živote? Dakle, svoju buduću ulogu, da tako kažemo.
The whole choice is really quite complex, based upon past life, lessons, issues, things that you didn't quite get right in the past, things that you have to work on. Then with the guidance of not only usually a spirit guide, very high level, wise being, but also even going into a specialty group called the elders, the council, the wise ones, and typically that is from 3 to 12 different very high-level beings, high-level souls, and then you have this conference and say, okay, this is what you've done, this is what you'd like to do, these are your aims, this is what you and then your other soul member, family members, they would like to do. This is what we would suggest. And here are actually 1, 2, 3 different lives that you could probably choose from that would really kind of fit what you would perhaps really like to learn. Then it comes back together and almost like this supercomputer figuring out how it can all happen. It's really quite amazing. Then, okay, I'll come in here this time as a male. My special friend over here will now come as a female. Last time it was a male. And,
naravno, sve to moramo zaboraviti, inače ne bi bilo fora, ne bi bio štos. Kada pričamo o ovim svim stvarima, one su naravno došle kroz stotine i stotine hipnotičkih regresija, međusobno potpuno nepovezanih ljudi koji su pričali po prilici iste priče, koji su hipnoterapeuti poput vas i Michaela Newtona, koji je to objavio u knjigama, nekako pokušali klasificirati, naći zajedničke točke među svim tim nepovezanim ljudima i na neki način objektivizirati tu čudnu stvarnost. Jedan od zanimljivih momenata je bio i to da ljudi ponekad, s obzirom da zaborave da su bili i negdje drugdje osim na ovom svijetu, a žele nekog sresti, opet od svojih prijatelja, dogovaraju nekakve znakove, simbole, sličice, boje. Kako to funkcionira kada se recimo neke duše požele ipak sresti na zemlji usprkos amneziji?
That's also very fascinating. It's a bit like in rehearsal, for a play. And you get together and you might put on some costumes, or you say, okay, we're going to be here. This is the country that we're going to live in. And we'll meet when you are 28 and I'll be 32. Okay? And of course, when you, like you said before, when you go into the earth, then you forget everything, and it gets very heavy down here and very, the conscious mind starts to take over, and then you totally forget. You don't even believe in spirit anyway, and you don't believe in reincarnation. But then you get to be 27, 28, and you get this feeling, and when you go back into the spirit level, into the rehearsal room, one says, I will be singing a song. Here's the melody, da, 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 and the other says, oh, that's very nice, and I think I will wear a lot of yellow. Yellow is my favorite color, and so during that time, you will recognize me by yellow, and says, you will recognize me because I'll be singing, Then one enchanted evening.
Nešto se upali. Znači, te signale na neki način prepoznamo kao nešto pravo, mada ni ne znamo zašto. Omiljena tema kod svih koji pričaju i koje zanimaju taj život između života jest pojam srodnih duša. Te srodne duše nemaju uvijek tako ružičast život kao što se misli. Što su srodne duše? Kako se nalaze? Nađu li se uvijek?
Yeah. Soulmates is kind of a confusing but sometimes a hopeful subject, because the fairy tale idea, the Cinderella idea, is that you meet this one special person and then it's going to be super love and you'll be living happily forever after and there's no more problems. And sometimes actually that happens. And on a spiritual level, oftentimes within a soul group, there might be especially 2, sometimes even 3, and they just love each other. They understand each other. They say, we are just so in tune, all the things that we do. And then when they have their earth assignments, then they also really get along quite well. And they, over a period of time, they say, boy, I like you, and let's really hook up. But then when you have the love and you have the family and you live together for 80 years and it's just wonderful, you can do that perhaps a couple of times, and then they say, well, okay, well, now what are we going to do? Let's learn, let's grow. And on a spiritual level, they don't necessarily care that we're going to live happily ever after. That's kind of a letdown as even a spiritual person doing this type of work. It's more about growth, learning, evolving, coming into a greater sense of self. It doesn't have to be just love, okay? So then we've got the soul group, and then the pair, the love mates, the soul mates, and they are so connected to each other. But then they say, okay, well, we've already done the love thing. Okay, what are we going to do now? So I recently, just this summer, had an interesting example of this pair that they're now in their 70s. They're best friends. They say, if I weren't married, they say both of us, if I weren't married to this other person for the last 40 years, I would be married to this person. Why am I with this person? And so then in a hypnotic sense, going into a spiritual memory, when they made their choices, they said, yes, this is your soulmate. You've already done it, but you're learning so much more through sometimes the tensions and the aggravations from your present partner. It's not as smooth as your best friend over here, but you're learning more.
Ono što ćemo naučiti ove sekunde da nam je vrijeme isteklo, jedno pitanje za kraj, je li moguće živjeti u društvu, a da čovjek nije žrtva masovne hipnoze?
My feeling, and one of the reasons why I wrote the book and I listed the different ways that we can be influenced, is that when we are aware of the different ways that we can be influenced and we can go into a trance state, then we'll be very aware when we go out and we buy things, we watch the news, we listen to politicians and so forth, and we are on the lookout for the different ways that we can be influenced, and we can say, aha, I see it, I'm not going to fall for it.
Drugim riječima, razlika je samo u osviještenosti. Ako si programiran da voliš neku glazbu, možeš i dalje voliti, ali bi bilo dobro da znaš da je to jedan od programa koje nosiš. U svakom slučaju, hvala vam na gostovanju, hvala i vama na pažnji i na tome što ste pratili ovaj razgovor sa Stevenom Russellom Poplinom, koji je autor kod nas neobjavljene knjige Dim iz zrcala o masovnoj hipnozi društva, nenamjernoj, tko zna, možda i namjernoj, sigurno ima tu i zloupotreba koje smo svi podvrgnuti. Nije to naravno nužno loše, sve ovisi o tome što hipnotizer od nas želi i znamo li uopće da smo hipnotizirani. Ponekad su oko nas tako nekakvi neprirodni politički konsenzusi koji sa svojim mantrama se neprekidno ponavljaju i doista mogu izgledati kao hipnoza. A tko je hipnotizer? Svakako, to je vrijedno sumnje, no eto, hipnoza nas može odvesti u neke druge svijetove. Kako god da bilo, nije loša stvar odlogirati se i postati svjestan vlastite svijesti, jer usprkos svim neobičnim susretima koji nas izgleda čekaju i nakon smrti, neko je rekao da smrt ne liječi neznanje. Laku noć.